giving you what you need. Well, in the holidays, I started reading the Anthony Trollope novel, The Warden. And this is a novel about an older man who's working towards retirement. He has an older unmarried daughter. And he's the warden of an old hospital in a rural English town. And life is pretty idyllic for him. But because of an antiquated estate arrangement, his income is much, much higher than really what it should be. And he doesn't really think much of it until it's made public. Once the journalists get a hold of it, his name is all over the newspaper. And this meek warden is publicly shamed. And so this poor old guy, he's absolutely mortified. The embarrassment, the sense of wrongness is overwhelming for him, and it drives him to despair. Now, one of the things that struck me the most as I was reading this book is that it was written in 1855. And, I kind of thought, well, now we live in a time of public shaming. If this book just felt so contemporary. If that was true then, that kind of public shaming could happen, how much more is that the case now? We live in such a shame culture where saying the wrong thing or being seen with the wrong people or having an old tweet resurface can lead to you being shunned or cancelled or publicly cast out. And you might not fear having your face and name plastered all over the newspaper, though maybe some of you do. But I think for many of us, smaller instances of this embarrassment and shame can be a reality or a risk for us in our workplaces and in our families and communities. But even if you're not afraid of that public shaming, we all know that feeling of internal shame, that deep sense of disgrace that can sit so heavily inside us. Whereas guilt says that I've done a wrong thing, shame says that I'm a wrong person, that I as a person am inadequate, that I'm not good enough. And it's this feeling that lingers, that feeling that can keep you awake at night as you ruminate on past failures and just feel like crawling into a hole. But shame is also more social than guilt. It tells us that we don't belong. It's that sinking feeling you get when you say something foolish at a meeting. And it's not just, oh, that was wrong, but I shouldn't be here. Or when you walk into a room and feel like everyone else belongs, but I don't. But worst of all, I think the worst kind of shame is the shame that tells us that we don't belong with God. The shame that makes us hesitate to pray or to step into church because we feel exposed. Well, today as we wrap up our series on encounters with Jesus, Jesus encounters the Apostle Peter. And Peter has publicly failed and been publicly shamed. But in this encounter, Jesus deals with Peter's shame. And so as we look at this encounter together, Peter can show us, and Jesus can show us, how as disciples we can find mercy even in the face and experience of our shame. Well, John chapter 21 is the final chapter of John's Gospel. And it's kind of like an epilogue. It comes after all of Jesus' ministry, comes after his climactic death and resurrection, comes even after his first appearance to the disciples where he commissions them to go out into the world and preach the gospel. And it's like this epilogue, it ties up some of the loose ends that are left hanging from the rest of the gospel. And one of those is Peter's disgrace, Peter's failure and shame. And so chapter 21 begins with Peter and 5 other disciples. They've gone back to fishing. That's what they were before Jesus called them. They were fishermen. And so there they are, waiting to see what's next. They're casting out nets into the sea, failing to catch anything. Jesus turns up, tells them to cast the nets onto the other side, and he gives them a miraculous catch, 153 fish. And so they come to shore, and Jesus is sitting there by a charcoal fire. and he invites them to sit down for breakfast. And it's around this barbecue on the beach that Jesus sits across from Peter and confronts him. In verse 15, Jesus asks, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, this isn't just a random question. This is pointed. Peter often claimed or demonstrated that he loved Jesus more than anyone. He was the one who had the guts to rebuke Jesus when Jesus said that he was going to die. And he boldly promised in that first reading we had from chapter 13 that he would follow Jesus anywhere. They would even lay his life down for Jesus. But when the moment came, Peter failed. Outside Jesus' trial, as Peter sat warming himself by a charcoal fire, he denied Jesus 3 times. And so in that bitter cold, when the rooster crowed, he was overcome with shame and he wept bitterly. But now at another charcoal fire, Jesus asks Peter, not once, but 3 times, "Do you love me?" So when he asks this, each time he exposes Peter and laying his shame bare. It's like Jesus is looking unflinchingly into Peter's soul. Yes, he knows that Peter loves him, but he also knows that Peter failed dismally. Now, when I look around this room, you'll be pleased to know that I don't look around and see a room of obvious failures. I know many of you, and even with our foibles, so many of you are accomplished and confident and impressive people. But so often our successes paper over an underlying spiritual sickness, shameful, hidden failures that we're desperate to conceal. Secret habits, procrastination, the risk of financial ruin, the things that we've said, things that we've done in disgrace in the past. And so we can end up not wanting anyone to see who we really are, or to even see the fear that's boiling underneath the surface. But just like Jesus saw Peter, Jesus sees each of us, and he knows our darkest and most shameful truth. But I think alongside this sense of shame and failure, and even it's not like this is just, well, some people feel ashamed and other people feel differently. I think these things sit alongside one another in our hearts. And part of us can feel deeply ashamed and keenly aware, but another part of us can have a sort of self-confidence and self-righteousness that actually it's not that shameful after all. It tells us we've got nothing to be ashamed of. But under Jesus' gaze, this part of us needs to be exposed. We need to let it confront us and make us unsettled, to realise how far we fall short of his glory. Now, sure, we might not do obvious, terrible things, but none of us love God or love others as we should. And this isn't just a random thing to say, because as Peter was failing to love Jesus in his denial of him, right alongside that, in chapter 18 of this gospel, Jesus was on trial, laying down his own life out of love for his people, out of love even for those who failed him. And so next to Jesus' incredible love, Peter's love is exposed as a failure, and our love is exposed, our lack of love is exposed too. Next to Jesus' perfect love, we are exposed and shamed in our failings. So, where does that leave us? What are we to do? Well, if Peter's and our problems are failure and shame, then they are met squarely with Jesus' mercy. They're met with Jesus' mercy. Now, all this talk about Jesus' unwavering gaze can make it sound like this was an interrogation. But this is a renewal. Because around this fire where a similar fire where Peter had warmed himself in denial, Jesus now serves up this breakfast in love to remove that shame and to welcome him in. 3 times Jesus asks Peter that penetrating question, do you love me? But he doesn't leave it there, because he gives Peter the chance 3 times to reaffirm his love for him. And not only for Peter to reaffirm his love for him, but notice how Jesus responds. 3 times he charges Peter, feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, feed my sheep. Jesus' plan for Peter was always that he would be a shepherd and overseer of his people. He had named him Peter, changed his name from Simon, son of John, to Peter, Petros, a rock, the rock on which his church was built. And so once more, Jesus reinstates Peter as this leading elder in his church. And that's exactly what Peter came to do. Now, we could talk more about what this looked like for Peter to feed Jesus' sheep, but our focus is on this mercy that Jesus shows Peter. Just as Peter denied Jesus publicly, so now Jesus reinstates Peter publicly. He honours him. He restores him to that place of honour. Picture it, with the warmth of the crackling fire and the cool morning air, and that aroma of fried fish as the friends pass around. And Peter, once filled with despair, now he hears these words from his friend and from his Lord that reinstate him, give him again that place of honour, and melt away that sense of shame and give him purpose again. I think this means 2 things for us today. And the first is that it means that you don't need to be ashamed of your failures before God. You don't need to be ashamed of your failures before God. If you follow Jesus, he accepts you. He does not shame you. Whether you have a hidden past that makes you want to bury your face in your hands, or you feel like a failure as a person, or you feel like you can't approach God because you don't feel worthy, Jesus' mercy covers all of it. And ultimately, it's because on the cross, he bore our shame. To the Jews, anyone who was crucified was cursed by God. To the Romans, crucifixion was a disgrace. You could barely even mention it. But as Jesus was on the cross, he bore not only our guilt, but also our shame and disgrace. And then through his resurrection, he brings us with him, crowns us with glory, and gives us a new identity as his honoured sons and daughters. Now, it's crucial that we understand this and accept this. I think this is especially powerful for us as we seek to overcome the sins in our lives that are repetitive, the things that we keep returning to, whether it be addiction or destructive habits, because it's this that gives us the power to change. Instead of being caught in a spiral of shame when we return to those things that we hate, and then we just feel worse about ourselves, which then makes us return to it again and even more, instead, we can see ourselves as restored, beloved, honoured children of God, and so find a way out of those destructive and shameful things in our lives. Now, if you picture God, if you were to picture him and picture his face, what do you see? I think for a lot of Christians, sadly, they picture a face that might be stern and dark, maybe like an unpredictable father, stern, looking down over his newspaper. But this is not at all what it should be. Now, we are not God's naughty little boys and girls. And because of Jesus, the face of God is like the face of a father returning home, running through the airport with arms outstretched, with joy in his face, arms open wide to welcome you in, his beloved child. This is he who sits with you by the fire and shares a hot breakfast with you, a warm smile, a gentle approving hug for you. We don't need to be ashamed before him. But the second thing that this means is that because God honours each of us, we need to honour one another, even in our shame. This is not just this shame that's taken away between us and God, but among one another. Peter denied Jesus publicly, and notice that Jesus is just restoring Peter publicly here at this fire. It's not just Jesus and him, but there are five other disciples right there with them. One of the barriers to us building really positive and hearty and close relationships and community with one another is the shame that we feel. Either we don't want to let others get too close in case they find out the truth about us, or, and I think this is a bit more insidious, there's a sense of shame that can prevent us from reconciling with one another. Often, we might talk about reconciling broken relationships. We say, well, it's important for us to forgive, to reach out to one another. And the opposite would be, well, if you don't do that, you're just being kind of stubborn or mean. But I think actually what stops us most of all from reconciling is a sense of shame. I think we know the wrong that's been done, and it's not a stubbornness, but an unwillingness to go through that discomfort of being exposed in front of one another. But I think once we can recognise and experience the way that Christ has taken our shame away, we can then be willing to be exposed in front of each other in that way. To approach each other, to approach other people in confidence that we don't need to be ashamed in front of one another. And in confidence and in trust that we will in fact honour each other as we seek to do that. We need to reach out and reinstate others in our lives, just as Christ has done for us. But Jesus hasn't finished with Peter, and he hasn't finished with us. Now, if you notice in the sermon outline, there's a final heading there, point 3. And if you'd looked at it in advance, you might have thought it was a typo. Living shamefully for Christ. Maybe that should be living shamelessly or something for Christ. But no, that's not a typo. Although we have been restored in relationship with Jesus and each other, following Jesus isn't going to be a life of glory and ease. In fact, it will mean living shamefully for Christ. In verse 18 and 19, Jesus says this strange thing to Peter. He says, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. And when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go." This sounds like a kind of a proverbial description of maybe just what it looks like to grow old. But John says that he said this to describe the kind of death that Peter would die. That this is Peter dying on a Roman cross like his Lord. His arms would be outstretched. He would be led to where he didn't want to go, led to his place of crucifixion, of execution. And then Jesus says to Peter, "Follow me." And this isn't Jesus saying, "Oh, come for a walk along the beach with me." No, this is saying, "Follow me to death." And that's exactly what Peter did. And according to tradition, Peter was shamefully crucified under Nero just 30 years later. And if we want to follow Christ, we have to be ready to follow him into that shame. to give glory to God. But what do I mean by that? What does that mean in practice? Well, it doesn't mean we just return to doing wrong and shameful things. Like a prisoner being released from prison and then just turning around and walking straight back in. It means following Jesus even when the world despises you for it. It's when you're shamed in the world's eyes. It means suffering for the sake of Christ so that he would be glorified. A while ago, I was in Malaysia. I was teaching and training young church leaders, and they were asking about Sydney, about my church. And among other things, I told them about what a remarkable place this was. Sydney in general, here in particular, beautiful place on the harbour's edge, lots of successful people, a lot of people who earn a lot of money, young people who can enjoy some of the best education and so on. And there was one young woman who said to me, what does it mean for Christians in Sydney to suffer for Christ? I was gobsmacked. I didn't quite know what to say. Living as a Christian in Malaysia isn't easy. But what about Sydney? Personally, I think this is something we haven't really developed, that we're sort of missing out on, this theology of suffering for Christ. Now, don't get me wrong. I do see people suffering. I see people suffering with illness and bereavement and relationship breakdown, and I see you do that with endurance and faith. But that's a bit of a different thing to this suffering for Christ that's spoken of here, and also in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus speaks about being blessed when you are persecuted for the sake of Christ. This is being willing to suffer because you follow Christ. It means living such a righteous life that you don't quite fit, that people notice that you're different, even to the point of ridiculing you or excluding you or passing you over for opportunities. I was speaking to someone just this week who took a risk to tell his friends that he wouldn't drink with them anymore because something in his life had happened to remind him of to convict him that wasn't part of his life that he wanted to return to anymore as a Christian. His friends actually, in the end, took it really well. But that was a risk that he took. I spoke with someone a while ago who nearly missed out on a promotion because in the process of it, they asked him about his views on sexuality and gender, and he spoke honestly about his biblical views. And it was a risk for him to be passed over. Now, for you, it might mean pressure from unbelieving family members when you insist on going to church, or pressure when you insist on living by biblical values. But it's not just living godly lives for Christ, it's also in the way we speak about Christ. We've been praying in our church prayer that would be so transformed by the Holy Spirit, and among other things, that we would have the boldness to share Christ with our neighbours as salt and light. The boldness to share Christ with our neighbours. To giving an answer to the faith we have in him, even when we feel like hiding it. And telling people that you're a Christian, telling them why, and inviting them to come and see Jesus. And again, I'm so encouraged when I hear stories about you doing this. Just this week, I bumped into someone at Coles who told me excitedly that they've invited their friends to church. And it always takes some courage, but we need to be willing to be ashamed so that Christ would be glorified in the way we live and in the way that we speak. Jesus warned Peter that he would follow him to crucifixion. And Peter followed boldly, knowing that his deepest shame had been removed. And so can we. Because of Jesus, our shame is no longer a burden that separates us from God. It's the gateway to life restored and loved and accepted by him. And so, like the warden in Anthony Trollope's novel, we can't escape shame. But unlike him and unlike so many, we have Jesus who meets us in our failure, and he offers mercy and not condemnation. So let us bring our shame to him and trust in his mercy.